Hi, Emily here from Homemade Emily Jane. Today I'm very excited to announce the release of my newest quilt pattern, the Keepsake Quilt Pattern. This quilt pattern is a classic star quilt pattern featuring sawtooth star quilt blocks. You've probably seen something like this before, so let me share a little bit behind the intention and the heart behind the Keepsake Quilt Pattern. I made my very first keepsake quilt years ago as my wedding guest book quilt, and I shared about it over on my blog at homemadeemilyjane.com. And over the years I've gotten tons of requests for the pattern for the quilt that I made for my wedding guest book quilt. It was a signature memory quilt where we had every guest at the wedding sign their own block to leave a special note for me and my husband. It is, to this day, one of my most cherished quilts because it reminds me of all the people in my life that came around us that day. And I wanted to make sure that I could create the actual pattern for that quilt in case you wanted to make a memory quilt like it as well. Now, a memory quilt can be great for all different kinds of occasions, not just weddings. Maybe it's for a milestone birthday, a graduation, maybe even a retirement. Those are just a few different ideas. I've seen some people do them for baby showers or other fun events as well. So if there's a milestone event in your life or in a loved one's life, this is a really great opportunity to make a signature memory quilt. Now, of course, you don't have to do a memory quilt out of your keepsake quilt, and I'll share some examples like this one behind me. I think it makes just a really beautiful pattern whether you do signatures on the blocks or not. I will add, inside the pattern there are tons of extra tips and tricks for making it into a memory quilt. So if you choose not to make it a memory quilt with it, you can just skip those pages in the pattern. Now, because of the intention for this quilt being a memory quilt, the pattern includes 8 sizes. Yes, 8 sizes. That's way more sizes than I normally include in a pattern, but I wanted to make sure that it was super versatile for you. And because it's block based, you can also add or take away blocks, or maybe even use some blocks in other ways. And there are ideas for that inside the pattern as well if you have too many blocks or not enough blocks. The 8 sizes included are anything from baby size all the way up to king bed size. So I have inside the Keepsake Quilt Pattern, baby size, lap size, 3 different throw sizes, and then 3 different bed sizes. So lots of different opportunities to add as many blocks as you want. I'll also add the sashing and the borders that you'll see on the quilt are separate from the star centers in the fabric requirements and cutting. So you'll be able to make those 2 different colors if you wanted, or you can eliminate the sashing and borders altogether for a different fun look to your quilt as well. If you are planning on making a signature memory quilt, I'll invite you to check out the links in the description below. That's where you'll find not only the link to find the Keepsake Quilt Pattern, but you'll also be able to find lots of tips and tricks that I have available on my website as well. If you're planning on making a memory quilt, or maybe just thinking about it, it's a really great resource for you to find lots of different ideas and tips. Now, I get asked all the time about the difficulty level of different patterns. So I've decided that this Keepsake Quilt Pattern is great for beginners. It teaches the 4 at a time flying geese method, which if you've never done before, I feel like this is the year of flying geese for me because the past few patterns that I've released have used flying geese. It's just a really great building block for quilting, and the 4 at a time flying geese method can be a little bit tricky at first, or a little bit overwhelming mentally at first, but once you've done it a few times, once you've seen how it works, it quickly became one of my favorite quilt blocks, and I'm sure it will for you as well. I have a video tutorial up showing that method, so check it out right here if you want to dive more into flying geese before you decide whether or not this is the right pattern for you. Now, I've got to share with you the fabric requirements for making your own keepsake quilt. You'll see on the screen here, I've got 8 different sizes, so lots of information packed in here. As I mentioned previously, the star centers fabric is separate from the sashing and borders. So you can make those the same color if you choose, like I did on some of my samples, or you can make those different colors. If you're going to do a signature quilt, I recommend white, for the star centers and have people sign in those stars, but the quilt actually looks really cool if you use a darker fabric for the stars as well. The accent colors are the colors of the fabric surrounding the star. So on this quilt, you'll see it's the rainbow. These are all scraps from my stash, but I made sure that that would be fat quarter friendly. And just a general rule of thumb, for every 5 blocks in your quilt, you'll need 1 fat quarter. And if you're using the 4 at a time flying geese method, you'll be glad to know that you can also use quarter yards instead of fat quarters. Those are interchangeable for making this specific pattern. It's not always the case because of how things are cut, but for this pattern, either quarter yards or fat quarters will both work. I will mention if you're using AccuQuilt, that is not the case, and I'll cover more about that in a bit. Now, the star outlines for the pattern are definitely fat quarter friendly, but you can also use scraps. So this quilt behind me is a great example. I used fabrics from my stash. I think I used about 20 different fabrics for this quilt, and you'll see I have like 2 or 3 blocks of each color. So when you're making your quilt, you can decide if you want to use fat quarters or if you just want to rummage through those scrap bins and pick out some fabrics. Either way, you can make a beautiful quilt. Now, as I briefly touched on earlier, the Keepsake Quilt Pattern is AccuQuilt friendly. I like to include AccuQuilt fabric cutting instructions for as many of my patterns as possible because I personally love using my AccuQuilt. I know it's not for everyone, so I make sure to put the AccuQuilt instructions at the end of the pattern. So if you are using AccuQuilt, you know where to find them. You can find exactly which dies are needed and how to cut them. So you'll see a cutting diagram if you're using AccuQuilt is included in the pattern. And that's one thing I'll say, if you wanted to use AccuQuilt, it's not really great to use a quarter yard. It's better to use a fat quarter in order to get all the pieces cut out using the way that the dies are laid out for the squares needed for the corners of each block. So just putting that out there, if you want to use AccuQuilt, I highly recommend using fat quarters for your keepsake quilt. Now, whether you're using AccuQuilt or not, I did want to cover some of my favorite quilting tools and supplies for making this quilt. I will include links to these in the description below. And also, if you wanted to come back to any of this information, make sure you check out my blog because I'm putting all the information about the Keepsake Quilt Pattern over on homemadeemilyjane.com. So let me talk about my favorite tools. First off, if you are new to quilting and you haven't tried starching your fabrics prior to cutting, it is a game changer. I personally use either Best Press or I've recently started trying some other different similar products as well. But whatever spray starch is your favorite, I recommend using it, especially for the flying geese in this pattern because that involves sewing on the bias. I really recommend one long quilting ruler. I use a 6.5 inch by 24 inch ruler for pretty much every quilt. So if you don't have one of those, that's a great one to have. For these specific blocks, I also recommend an 8.5 inch square ruler, and I'll find that, I tend to find that super useful for a lot of my projects as well. If you're making the 4 at a time flying geese, I recommend getting the wing clipper ruler. Of course, you can use a regular ruler to trim your flying geese, but this just makes trimming flying geese a lot easier. There are some other similar products out there. I know Creative Grids has a flying geese trimming ruler and a few others. I personally just have the wing clipper ruler, so I'll link that below for you. If you are planning on adding sashing and borders to your keepsake quilt, I really cannot recommend Stripology enough. So there's something called the Stripology XL ruler. It is a bit of an investment, but I find it incredibly useful. I wouldn't want to cut out all these strips without it. So check out this video right here if you want to learn more about the Stripology ruler, and check the description below for the link. And as I mentioned earlier, AccuQuilt, if you wanted to learn more about using an AccuQuilt machine, I have tons of resources on my website and here on YouTube for you. So if you wanted to make your keepsake quilt using AccuQuilt, you'll need your AccuQuilt cutting machine as well as the 8-inch Go mix and match cube. So now that I've told you all about this keepsake quilt pattern, let's talk about some inspiration for making your own. I've made 3. The first one I already told you about. This was the wedding guest book quilt that I made. It has signatures from so many loved ones and family members that came to our wedding, and it's really so cherished in my home. So if you wanted to make a similar one, I just used different shades of blue and gray for this to make it a little bit more on the neutral side towards my home decor style. And I used white fabric for the starch centers that got signed, and I used white for the sashing and borders. Another sample quilt I made was this beautiful green baby quilt. This is a gift for one of my friends that just had a baby. I did want to show you the quilting on this one. I did a simple grid quilting using just straight lines, and then I went back in and did another grid that was a ½ inch away from that first grid. So it created a fun little texture and it was super easy to do. So I highly recommend something like that for your keepsake quilt. And the third keepsake quilt that I made is this one right behind me, the rainbow quilt. This was a scrap buster for me and just a fun way to show you how to use some scraps for your keepsake quilt. I'll share with you a few mock-ups as well. I definitely wanted to show you how fun this quilt pattern looks with a dark star. So if you're not getting signatures on your star centers, using a dark fabric like this navy blue is a great option. Or maybe a pretty pink with these mauves. Lots of different options too. So let me share with you a few more mock-ups. And finally, I had some really wonderful quilt pattern testers test out this keepsake quilt for me. One of my favorites is Hannah from the Back Porch Stitcher, is currently working on a wedding guest book quilt as well. So she captured a few photos of the signed blocks and from the wedding. My friend Sarah tested her keepsake quilt using this really fun polka dot fabric for the star centers. And then you'll also see Laura made this really pretty keepsake quilt as well. She quilted this one herself on a long arm quilting machine. I hope you're inspired by seeing these different quilts made using the keepsake quilt pattern and just how different they can be. If you want to make your own, I highly recommend you check out the fat quarter bundles that I have available in my shop. The fat quarter bundles are curated by myself and you can grab them as they become available. Once they're sold out, they're gone. So I highly recommend grabbing any that catch your eye today. If you love seeing these keepsake quilts, please drop a comment below to let me know which one is your personal favorite. And if you have any questions, I'm always here to answer them. So make sure you grab the keepsake quilt pattern today. Head over to my website, homemadeemilyjane.com, and subscribe here on YouTube for lots more quilting tips, tricks, tutorials, and quilt patterns. Happy sewing!